Hi, welcome to Sunlight on Suffield. I'm Annie Hornish. Today we're going to be discussing freedom of information laws, and we're thrilled to have with us here today Russell Blair, who is the Director of Education and Communications with Connecticut's Freedom of Information Commission. Thank you for coming and welcome, Russell.
No, it's so great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. So why don't we start off by telling us what is the FOIA Commission and what's its purpose?
Sure. So many people may know about the Freedom of Information Act in Connecticut, and what's unique, really in Connecticut among all the different states. A lot of states have open records laws or sunshine laws. They'll call them. But in Connecticut, we have a commission where I work, and the sole thing that our commission does is enforce the Freedom of Information Act. So, we have a really strong open government law here in Connecticut because we have an agency that's in charge of policing it, and that's what I do. In my role is I educate, I do training sessions. We want to make sure public officials know what the law requires, and then we have attorneys that do investigations when there's alleged violations of the Freedom of Information Act. So that's really what makes Connecticut kind of stand above the rest of the country in terms of open government, is that we really have some accountability, when records aren't released or when meetings are not conducted properly.
Okay, and so why was there a reason the FOIA Commission was formed, and when was it formed?
Sure. So the Freedom of Information Act and the Commission, dates back to 1975. And if you're a student of history, if you think back to what was going on in the early 1970s, it was really a post-Watergate reform. There was a lot of concern about government secrecy, about records being destroyed, secret meetings, decisions being made in the dark. And at the time when all that was happening, Ella Grasso was a congresswoman from Connecticut. She was down in Washington. She saw what was happening. She wasn't happy about it. And a couple years later, she contemplated a run for governor, and that was part of her platform, was she wanted to create an open government, an open records law, a sunshine law here in Connecticut. And she strongly believed in it. And then when she got elected, she pushed for the Freedom of Information Act, and as part of that, the creation of the commission. And interestingly enough, if anyone has ever dealt with the legislature, you know how hard it can be to get people to agree on anything. The Freedom of Information Act, when it was passed, it actually passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate. So there was a lot of support, bipartisan support for the law. Certainly it's changed over the years, and I'd be happy to discuss some of that. But at the beginning there was a lot of support. And really, it was meant to make our government accountable to the citizens. Public servants, whether you work for state government or local government. I always like to remind people the taxpayers are paying for our salaries. When we elect people, we are electing them to represent us, to make decisions on behalf of us. So we have to have insight into how they're making those decisions, and that's really what freedom of information is all about.
Yeah. Ella Grasso, a great woman, great governor. We were lucky to have her. So, what do you do in your day-to-day job as in your position?
Sure. So it really entails a lot. The title is Director of Education and Communications, so I certainly do a lot of education. We do training sessions for really anyone that will have us, state agencies, municipalities, police departments, boards of education, even sometimes citizen groups, groups of citizens that are interested in learning more about how they can use freedom of information. So I certainly do a lot of those training sessions. And then, a lot of the other time, it's answering questions from anyone who calls into our office. If anyone, is watching this and they have any questions about freedom of information, they can always call the commission. They can get me on the phone. I'd be happy to help people make records requests. Sometimes I get calls from town officials. They have questions about meetings. What do they have to put on the agenda? When do they have to file the minutes? Can they go into executive session, a closed session, to discuss certain things? So that's part of it too. And then another part of it is when people do file complaints with us, we get 600 or 700 complaints a year about alleged FOI violations. We try to work with both parties to resolve those amicably if we can. Sometimes we find that it's not so much that a town is unwilling to give out information, it just may be that they don't quite understand what the obligation is under the Freedom of Information Act. So we use education as a tool to try to resolve those disputes. At the end of the day, in my view, it's really all about getting people the information that they're looking for. So if I can assist as an ombudsman to help with that, that's another thing that I do.
Okay. So when there are FOIA violations, what are the penalties, or what does that look like?
Sure. So, somebody files a complaint with our commission. If we can't resolve it through the ombudsman process, what happens is we have what we call a contested case hearing, where basically one of our attorneys kind of acts as the judge, and both sides will present their evidence and their facts as to what happened in the case. If the hearing officer believes that there was a violation, they'll write up a report. They'll write, what the violation was, and then our commission will adopt that report. And sometimes the penalties, they can vary. The strongest thing we can do is we can issue fines. Fines can be up to $5,000. We don't do fines too often. We try to work with people through education, but we can issue fines. We can mandate that towns attend education sessions. Sometimes that'll happen if we feel like there's a situation where there's a misunderstanding or people don't quite know what they're supposed to do. We can order an education session. In terms of records, we can compel a public agency to provide records to a requester. So if somebody makes a request and the town won't turn over, whatever the records may be, maybe it's a, personnel investigation in town hall, somebody was disciplined, somebody's asking for a copy of that investigation, the town doesn't want to give it out, the person files a complaint, our commission could order the town to release those records. And in the case of meetings, potentially the strongest thing we could do with a meeting is if there's an improper meeting, maybe an agenda was not posted or something like that, we can declare null and void actions taken at a meeting. We could tell a public agency, you have to go back, do that again, have a public meeting, make sure the agenda is proper. So the penalties can really vary depending on the severity of the situation, but certainly, we have issued fines to some agencies when they've appeared before us, time and time again with repeated violations.
Okay. And that is a factor then. If there seems to be a pattern of improper meetings, that would obviously factor into whether a town would get cited or...
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
So, every case is different. Every complaint is based on, a one violation or a group of violations. So when somebody files a complaint, it's got to be about what the complaint, the hearing is going to be about that complaint. But we do take notice of, who is appearing before us time and time again. And if we see successive violations, that's something that the commissioners we'll take notice of. And anybody who files a complaint with us can request a fine. We call it a civil penalty. So it's always an option that somebody can request. Again, the commission doesn't do it all the time, but I think when they see people coming before us time and time again, or maybe a situation where somebody has been ordered to do a training session and they're still having successive violations, at that point, we may say, look, this is not about a lack of knowledge about the law. Maybe this is more willful, or this is just that people don't care about what their obligations are. So in those cases, that might be something where a fine might be something the commission would look toward. Right.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, we do have some issues in Suffield with what we perceive to be improper meetings, having people in executive sessions that they don't vote on it or invite them in. That's happened on multiple occasions, and some people are starting to notice this. And so this is why the show is so helpful with the information you're giving us, so citizens know what to do and who to contact. So is there what's involved with making a FOIA request?
Sure. So I think many people think it's a lot more complicated than it is. If you want to make an FOI request, really all you have to do is write a letter or an email to whichever department has the records that you're looking for, and just clearly state, what you're seeking. So if you want, copies of building permits, you write to the building department, I want a copy of the permits for a certain property. If you want a police report, you go to the police station, you send an email, you could bring a letter, you can hand deliver something, and just state, I want the report from this incident that happened at this date, time, and place. I think one important thing that if you're making an FOI request you want to be aware of is try to be as specific as you can, because in some ways you have to imagine, if you put, the shoe on the other foot, if you're the town official and somebody makes this giant wide-ranging request that is meandering all over the place, or you don't specify what you're looking for, I want all the files about the firehouse project, you need to be a little bit more specific. So I would say be specific, be clear, but know that any written request for records in Connecticut is an FOI request. You don't need to use a special form, you don't need to use any magic words or cite the statute or anything like that. Every town should understand that if you write to them asking for public records, then that's considered to be an FOI request, so they need to handle it appropriately.
So it has to be in writing. An email is fine? Email is usually probably the most common form?
Sure. So,
Okay.
yeah, if you want copies of records, you have to put it in writing. You can go into any town hall and verbally request to inspect records. So if you want to, just review files, you want to pull the building file for your property and look at what permits are in there, maybe, after you purchase your home, you can always go in and ask to inspect records, but if you want copies, you do have to put something in writing. So I would suggest in any event with FOI, it's always good to put it into writing so you have copies of the correspondence, with the public agency. We hope it doesn't come to you having to file a complaint, but it's important that you document the process. When were you in contact with the town? How long have you been waiting? So email can be a good way to kind of keep a paper trail of the back and forth related to your request.
That's a good tip. Thank you for that. Visual inspections. How soon, can someone walk into a town department and demand to see something immediately, or does the town have a right to send them, come back at a future date?
So there's nothing in the Freedom of Information Act that requires immediate production of records, whether it's a visual inspection or copies. What the law says is that public agencies have to provide prompt access to public records. So it's not a specific time frame, but it needs to be reasonable. We take into account certain factors. In your example, if somebody was the only person working in an office and they were busy with a project or something, then they could tell the requester, can you come back in 2 days? We'll pull those files for you. We'll set them up in a conference room. So they can take some time to do these requests, but it needs to be reasonable. If you're asking for one piece of paper and the town is telling you it's going to take 6 months, that's not reasonable. But it can vary depending on the size and scope of the request. If a requester makes a really large request and there's no limitation on how big of a request you can make under FOIA, but if you make a large request, you should expect that it might take some time for the town to parse through that and to provide you with the records.
Okay, that's good to know. So what fees can an agency charge to provide copies of public records?
So if we're dealing with paper records, which, the universe of paper records is kind of ever shrinking, but if it's a paper record, 50 cents per page for cities and towns. State agencies can charge 25 cents per page. I think what people may find interesting is there are no fees associated with requests for electronic records. So if you want copies of emails, or you want copies of, a video, photographs, any kind of PDF, anything that is a digital document that exists digitally, and you ask for a digital copy, they have to provide that to you at no charge. They could charge for a storage device if it needed to go onto a USB stick or something like that, but they're not charging you a per page fee if it's a digital record. Okay.
Well, through my employer, I sometimes have to FOIA through some state agencies, notably DEEP or DOAG. I do often request records. DEEP especially, they're saying now that it could take up to 3 months to produce reports. Is that, in your opinion, unreasonable? And they say it's due to a backlog of FOIA requests.
So, I think it depends on, again, every request is unique, the size and the scope of the request, the staffing level of the agency, other business that they have to conduct and get done, are different factors that we look at. But to your point about backlogs, that is something that we keep an eye on. I have heard from different agencies that there can be backlogs of months before they get to a person's request because, particularly law enforcement, with the advent of body cameras, I think when the legislature passed the body camera law, we were thinking about a lot of things that were important, police accountability and having body cameras as a tool to, hold officers accountable, to have an accurate recording of what happened. Maybe we didn't think enough about the FOI part of it because now you have police departments who are getting inundated with requests for body camera, and in some cases that can be a struggle, to keep up. What I'll say is, I don't think staffing is an excuse. It's part of it, but I think this is an obligation of all public agencies. What our courts have said is that complying with the Freedom of Information Act is a primary duty of public agencies, so they need to make sure that they devote resources to this. It can't be something where people are having to wait months and months and months to even figure out if they're going to get the records that they're seeking. So it needs to be something that they devote time and resources to. Each request is going to be unique, so it's hard to specify. But we hear about the staffing issues. But again, this is something that every agency has to find a way to get this done.
So in terms of penalties for agencies or towns, when the law first came out, were there more? Was it strict? Are we getting stricter and stricter with the penalties, or higher penalties for violations, or is it about the same?
So the penalty has risen. The maximum amount. Actually, in the last legislative session, it used to be $1,000 maximum fine. Now it's been increased to $5,000 fine. So the penalties have gotten stiffer. But again, I really think the commission. We try not to use that tool unless we need to. I think the biggest change with FOI since the law passed really has been the advent of all these new digital records. And in my opinion, the law gets when the law gets changed. Typically, it's people adding exemptions. Certain new categories of records that we want to make not available under freedom of information. But the law has not really been modernized to account for all of the new technology and the new ways that we communicate and all the new records that exist. One example, just a small one we mentioned earlier, police body cameras. There's some legislation this year looking at potentially implementing fees for police body camera because of how many requests departments are getting, and that this is kind of a new record that requires a lot of work in terms of redacting the video and editing out things that can't be disclosed. So I think one of the struggles with the FOI Act is always that technology is evolving and the law is not always evolving with it. You imagine back in 1975, everything was on paper, and there probably weren't as many records as there are today. When I'm doing training sessions with public officials, I say, look, every email you send is a record, and imagine how many emails you send in a day and all the records that are being created. So there's this massive amount of digital information, and I feel like that's one of the things where towns sometimes can struggle is, we have all this digital information. People can ask for it, but we don't have an easy way to deliver it, even if they want to. It's not always a situation where a town doesn't want to give out the information. It can just be very complex, especially a small town where maybe you don't have a lot of IT support. So how do you process those requests for large amounts of digital information?
Now, you mentioned that electronic records can be provided, shall be provided at no cost to the requester. Can a town determine that they only will provide paper, or if it's requested for electronic, do they have to provide
So what the law states is that if they have it available digitally and you want a digital copy, they have to give you the digital copy at no charge. They don't have to scan things in. So if it's a paper, let's say somebody wants copies of dog license applications and they're existing on paper and the town hasn't digitized them, they're not required to digitize them to respond to a request. Or really with freedom of information, it's providing the records that you have as you keep them, as you maintain them in the formats that exist, in the town hall. They're not required to convert them. They're not required to create new records or do research in response to a records request. It's really just sharing the same information that they have, making that available to the citizens.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, this is a little nuanced here. How long does an agency have to prepare minutes after a meeting has occurred?
Sure. So minutes need to be filed within 7 days of a meeting. That's what the law states. So, with 7 days after a meeting, you should be able to go into town hall, go to the town clerk's office. That's an important thing, I think, for people to know is that a lot of the requirements of freedom of information go through the town clerk's office. So that's where you should be looking for agendas, notices of special meetings, minutes, all that type of information is going to be found in the town clerk's office. That's kind of like your one-stop shop to find out, what's going on with public meetings. Certainly, a lot of towns now have websites where you can find a lot of that available, but you want to be mindful that not everything is always going to be on the website. If you're ever uncertain or you can't find something, I would call up town hall, call the town clerk, and they're going to have the most up-to-date and information about meetings and that are upcoming.
One thing I learned in this process is and correct me if I'm wrong, but if a commission or board files meeting minutes, that within 7 days, they can be altered, the meeting minutes can be changed, and so it's important to follow the paper trail of everything that happens, because it's only that first document that it's not always the final document.
Yes,
with minutes, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any board, the next time they meet, when they vote on the minutes, there could be changes. So you do want to go forward and look and see and make sure that there weren't any changes, to the minutes at a future meeting.
Yeah. Okay. do members of the public have a right under the Freedom of Information Act to speak at public meetings?
This is a really common question we get, and the answer actually is no. There's no law, freedom of information or otherwise, that gives anyone a right to speak at a meeting. The law is about access to the meetings, so they can't prevent you from coming to the meeting. You're allowed to sit there, you're allowed to observe, but whether or not you speak or participate is really up to the board. So they can limit public comment to only residents of the town, or they could set a time limit, or they can say that you got to state your name and address. They can't do any of that to allow you into a meeting. Nobody can ask your name or address to attend a public meeting. But if you want to speak, if you want to address the board, then they can set the parameters and the requirements that go along with that.
Interesting. And different boards within the same town can set their own
Yeah,
specific
and
policies.
even really meeting to meeting.
Yep.
There could be a situation where there's 50 people that want to speak at public comment, and maybe the board doesn't normally have a time limit, but they might say we can only do 2 minutes
Yep.
a person tonight because we have a lot of people here who want to talk and we want to give everyone time.
Okay. Can an agency vote to consider business that was not listed on its meeting agenda?
They can, and this was actually a little bit of a surprise to me, even as a former journalist who covered a lot of public meetings. This was something that I learned a little bit more about when I came to the commission. So at a regular meeting, by a 2/3 vote, they can add items to the agenda that were not on there, and they can discuss them, and they can take action. So certainly, I think in most cases, most boards try to put everything on the agenda that's going to come up. But if you're really interested in what a board is going to do, especially at a regular meeting, you want to make sure you try to attend. I think one thing that is a benefit now is a lot of towns have moved to either hybrid meetings or remote meetings, so there's more ability to monitor these meetings without necessarily having to get in the car and drive down to town hall. But if you're interested in what a board is doing, it's important to pay attention to the meetings or look at the minutes and see what happened at the meeting, because the agenda is not always going to tell you everything, because they could add items. Or sometimes agenda items, may not necessarily reflect what's going to happen at the meeting. The courts have said the agendas need to fairly apprise the public, but sometimes we see agenda items that don't necessarily line up with what exactly happens at the meeting. So it's important to look at the minutes or try to monitor the meeting if you want to find out what's going to happen.
Okay, that's very useful to know. What about executive sessions? Do they have a duty to put what the subject matter of the executive session is about, or the people being discussed in the executive session on the agenda?
So with executive session, which is basically a closed session of a public meeting, it is important that the topic that they're going to discuss, that the board is going to talk about, is on the agenda, more so than just the statute. Sometimes we see people where they'll cite the reason they're allowed under law to have an executive session: personnel, security.
Yep.
Our commission has said you need to have more than that. Executive session to discuss, security updates at Smith Lane School or something like that. The public doesn't get to be there for the executive session, but they have the right to know the topic of what is being discussed. So it's important that there's a little bit more detail there. Again, they're not going to know what the commissioners think and what they're discussing, and any votes need to be taken in public, but they should know the topic that, of that executive session.
Okay, thank you. So if a person believes that there was a FOIA violation, how long does he or she have to file a complaint with the commission?
So this is really important, because this does trip people up, especially if they're new. You need to file a complaint within 30 days of a violation. So if we're talking about a meeting where something went wrong, within 30 days of that meeting date, you would need to file with our office.
Okay.
When you make a records request, you can file within 30 days of any attempt you've made to get your records. So if you make a records request and you've been following up every 2 weeks, every time you follow up, you restart that 30-day clock. So with records requests, the timing is not as much of a concern because you could always go back and renew the clock. But with a meeting, if something happened, you have to file the complaint within 30 days.
Okay. Is there a form that a person wishing to file a complaint with the Freedom of Information Commission must complete?
So you don't have to use a form, but we do have one on our website. If you go to ct.gov/FOI on our website there's a form that you can use. You could also just send us an email to foi@ct.gov. You could just send us a complaint in an email. Make sure you include contact information that we can reach you if we have questions. But you could just send us an email or use the form. Either option is fine.
Okay, thank you. And one more question, excuse me. Do persons who file complaints with the commission need to be represented by an attorney? I think you've answered that already, right?
Sure. No, you
Yep.
don't. You don't need to have an attorney. We really kind of pride ourselves on being what we call a citizens commission. This law is really meant to. A lot of times people think FOI is for journalists or attorneys, but really it's meant to be for any citizen who has a concern about a records request or about a meeting. You don't need an attorney to file with us. It's free of charge. The hearings are meant to be accessible for people who are not attorneys.
I think we have time for one more question, actually. Does the commission act on tips?
We do not. So everything that we deal with, if you want the commission to look at it, you need to file a complaint with us. Sometimes people ask, can you file an anonymous complaint? The answer to that is no. You do have to put your name on it if you want to file a complaint with us, but we don't act on tips. We don't investigate based on that. We need to have a complaint in front of us. But anyone can file a complaint, anyone who requested a record, anyone who attended a meeting. So if you have a concern, my best advice would be to file a complaint. Nothing bad will happen if you file a complaint, but if you don't file a complaint, the agency's not going to be held accountable because we're not going to do anything unless we have something to act on.
Okay. I think we might be able to get one more question in, actually. Say that I'm unable to find the information I need. Would the FOIA Commission assist me in finding that information?
So we cannot assist you in making your request. A lot of people think that we are the repository of all state records, and we're not. So you do have to make your request to whichever agency has those records, whichever town has it, or whichever police department or board of education. You come to us when you're having trouble getting the records. When you don't get what you're looking for, your next call can be us, but you have to make the request first to whoever has those records.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on our show today. This was an incredible amount of information to have, and we're really grateful for you to take the time to be with us here today. So thank you for watching this episode of Sunlight on Suffield, and we'll see you next time.